I don't know if you've ever been lost inside a building where you were in, say, a large indoor flea market or a large building or a hospital with a lot of additions, and you got turned around and you didn't know where you were, and you couldn't find your way out. The last part of Ezekiel is an 8-chapter vision of the temple, and you could get lost in there. You get in and you start looking around and you start trying to figure out what Ezekiel is talking about. You start looking for advice. You could spend a lot of time in the last chapter of Ezekiel, and it would be time well spent. It's very interesting. There are a lot of exegetical and biblical issues going on in Ezekiel, and they pop up in relevance at various times because they're connected to the land of Israel, and we wonder about them being connected to the end times. But we're going to close out our series in the book of Ezekiel by looking at these last couple of chapters, particularly the 40 through 43, where it talks about Ezekiel's vision of the temple. But we want to close by trying to figure out what all this means. So here are the basics. 10 years after the last vision that Ezekiel has had, and 25 years after Ezekiel has been in the land. So it's 25 years later after that first vision that Ezekiel had by the river Kebar, where he saw the glory of God in his chariot of glory. It's 25 years later. And God comes to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is transported back to the land of Israel. It doesn't specifically say Jerusalem, it says Israel. Goes back to Israel, and he is put on a high mountain. We're not told where that is. And by his supernatural angelic guide, he is led through a temple. The temple is already built, and the temple is very meticulously described. There's a measuring rod. He starts off with the outside walls, and he tells you how thick the walls are. He tells you how many steps are going up to the eastern gate. The eastern gate is the one that would face directly at the temple. He tells you the depth of the gate, the portico leading into the gate. He talks about the depth and the size of the guard inlets inside the wall where the guards would wait. He tells you about the size of the courtyard. He tells you about the entire courtyard. He tells you about the other gates. He tells you about some of the altars that are near the gates. He tells you eventually about the temple and about the side rooms. It's a vision of a temple that is already built. It is glorious. And there are a couple of things that are very interesting about it. If you remember in the book of Ezekiel, the exiles have gotten word that the temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed. This is the temple that Solomon, son of David, built, and it became one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Babylonians destroy it, they raze it, the Ark of the Covenant is lost forever, and it's destroyed. So they're in mourning that they've lost their temple, they've lost their nation, they've lost everything, and God is beginning to give them messages of hope. He's told them that he will give them a new heart. He's told them that he will resurrect the nation. That's the valley of dry bones. He's told them that he will protect them from their enemies, not only now, but forever. And now after a 2-chapter vision of how he will protect them from their enemies, he embarks on this long vision of the temple. So when he's giving this picture of the temple doesn't exist. Complicating matters further, in 586 BC, something like that, Cyrus, the Great of Persia, comes to power and gives the Jews the freedom to go back to Israel. And they go back to Israel and they rebuild the temple. That's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's a historical fact that everybody knows. The Jews went back and rebuilt the temple. But they didn't build this temple. They didn't build Ezekiel's temple. They built a temple that looked like Herod's temple. And Ezekiel's temple and Herod's temple don't look the same. So Ezekiel's temple is meticulously described, the size, the width, the depth, the breadth, but it's never been built. It's never been built. So it remains a huge mystery for Bible scholars, for people who just like to read the Bible, and for anybody That's why you can get in there and start reading and start looking and start wondering what it would look like. If you go on the internet, you'll find pictures of what the temple would look like if you followed all of the directions for building it. But the question is, if it was never built, why was the vision given? What was God getting at? What does it mean? So it's very hard to figure it out. Ezekiel gives, in Ezekiel chapter 40, he gives a picture of the area around the temple. He talks about the eastern gate. He talks about the south gate. He talks about the inner gate. Then, at the end of chapter 40, he talks about rooms where the sacrifices would be washed. And so this is a place where you would prepare the animals for the animal sacrifices that would be made inside the temple. As you remember, a big part of Herod's temple was that that's where sacrifices were made. Every morning and every evening, sacrifices were made. That's where people brought their Passover sacrifices and their Shavuot sacrifices and their Day of Atonement sacrifices. And they would be sacrificed by the priests, and the shedding of blood would bring the forgiveness of sin. And the message to the people was, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. And so there's a place for sacrifices here, and it's expected that sacrifices will be done here. Then he describes the temple. The temple is beautiful, and the measurements are much like the same as Herod's temple. It's mostly the courtyard that looks very different. And the building that's around the temple looks different than in Herod's day. And he describes that, but there's no furnishings in it. He doesn't describe any candles. He doesn't describe an altar. He doesn't describe a table of showbread. All of these things for Bible fans are things that were in the holy place. And of course, the Holy of Holies was the room where the Ark of the Covenant was, and that was meant to be the throne of God. But the Holy of Holies in this temple is empty, because there is no Holy of Holies. There is no temple or Ark left. So this beautiful temple, this picture of the temple, he goes through and he describes all of it. And then he describes in chapter 43 how the glory of God returns to this temple. If you remember, early on in the book of Ezekiel, one of the most striking moments in the book is when Ezekiel is given a vision of God's presence leaving Jerusalem. He is watching the city in a vision, and the presence of God moves up and out of the Holy of Holies and to the doorway, and then it hovers over the gate of the city, and then it just disappears. And God has instead revealed himself to his people in exile. But now, with this new temple, the glory comes back. And so it's a wonderful thing. And then the altar is restored. And then the priesthood is restored. And then he talks about Israel being restored. And then he talks about the tribes being given back the land. And the way that the land is allotted doesn't line up with how the land was allotted in the book of Joshua. So you've got all these things going on. And the reality is that after the Jews go back to the land, they don't build Ezekiel's temple. They don't allot the land to the tribes. They're not 12 tribes anymore. Most of the tribes are lost forever. They're Judah and to some degree Levi and Benjamin. They don't give the land back to the tribes as it is in the vision. And the holiness of God does not return to the temple. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild Herod's temple, but the glory of God does not return. And so what is this talking about? So there's this ongoing thought of what does the temple vision mean? And so the next thought is that maybe the temple will be built sometime in the future. This is not only because it hasn't been built yet, and there are clearly blueprint plans for it, but also in Jesus' ministry, when he's talking about his second return, he refers to an abomination that causes desolation, which is a fancy phrase which means somebody desecrating the temple. And that actually does happen in 70 AD when the Romans destroy the temple. Jesus is talking about that the Romans are going to come and destroy Jerusalem and the people are going to be scattered. But partway through his explanation in Matthew chapter 24, it seems like he's talking not just about the Romans destroying Jerusalem, but about the end times when the enemies of God will destroy, will come against the people of God before he returns a second time. And so we begin to wonder if there's a future abomination to the temple. And if there is, there's got to be another temple. The question is, when is that built? And so some think, well, could this be built, and could this be part of when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom on the earth? This temple will be built. And so that makes sense because you're throwing it into the future. It's a perfect temple, perfect Jesus. He builds the temple. The question is, why would there be animal sacrifices? And it says very clearly in chapter 42 that these are sin sacrifices that people are making. I'm sorry, at the end of chapter 40. Why would they be making sin sacrifices in the millennium? Jesus has come back and he's been the sufficient sacrifice for sins. He's ended all sacrifice. So that doesn't really make any sense. It could be that the temple is built during the time period before Jesus comes in a kind of resurgent Jerusalem where the Jews are living in the land and they decide to build the temple. And that's the temple that the Antichrist desecrates before Jesus comes back. And then the temple is kind of purified and maybe part of the millennial kingdom. That would make some sense because you could see the Jewish people wanting to rebuild this temple. And you could see them even enacting animal sacrifice because it's only through Christ that we don't do animal sacrifices. Jesus is our sufficient sacrifice. So that would make some sense. And in fact, if you want to get lost, if you want to kill, say, 2 or 3 hours of your life, go on the internet and talk about rebuilding Ezekiel's temple. And you will find people all over the place talking about building it. You will see Jews who have plans to rebuild it. You will see news articles about how Trump and Putin are going to rebuild the temple, which would probably be a really bad idea since it would start off a huge war with Muslims all over the world. But you'll see people saying that's what's going to happen, and it's going to lead to a huge war, and the Jews are going to get their temple because Ezekiel's temple has never been built. And somebody wants to build it, and you build it. It's a politically fragile area. There are Jews in the land now. So it's understandable that people would talk about, what if you built this now? And it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. It's a spiral. And there are people that talk about what the temple will look like if it's built in the future, and that it will be built, and how it fits into prophecy, all of which we don't have time to go into now. The problem is that even if Trump and Putin got together and built a temple on the Temple Mount or somewhere in Jerusalem and built it exactly like Ezekiel wants to build it, they could never do what happens with this temple. Because in chapter 47 of Ezekiel, Ezekiel sees a vision of the temple, and there's a river flowing out of the temple. There's no river in Jerusalem. There's a river flowing out of the temple, and it starts in the temple. It flows out from the temple. That's its source, is the Holy of Holies. It flows out of the temple, down the steps, out through the side of the eastern gate, and it flows down into the city. And everything it touches, it makes beautiful. Everything it touches, it makes fertile. It actually, in the vision, flows down into the Dead Sea, and it makes the salty Dead Sea alive. It makes it a place where fish live and animals live and plants grow. And it's very involved, but wherever this water goes, it brings new life. It's impossible to read the vision without thinking of the Garden of Eden, how there were 4 rivers that flowed through the Garden of Eden, and it was very lush. It's hard not to think of the final vision of God in the last book of the Bible in Revelation 21 and 22, where there's a river of life for the healing of the nations. In that vision, in Revelation 21 and 22, there is a vision of the city of Jerusalem that looks a lot like Ezekiel's vision. It's after Jesus comes back and he's done away with evil and he's renewed the heavens and the earth and the city comes down out of heaven. That looks a lot like Ezekiel. But in that vision, in Revelation 21 and 22, there's no temple. Jesus is the temple. And that, of course, leads us to wonder, if we're going to apply this whole vision to ourselves, as Christians, we need to think of an Old Testament prophecy about the building of the temple through the lens of Jesus. We are Jesus' people. And it really seems that Jesus went out of his way to apply this prophecy of the temple to himself. In John chapter 1, when that famous verse in John chapter 1, verse 14, where it says, "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." That word dwelling is the same word that was used for tabernacle. He became flesh and became a temple among us. And then it goes on to say, we have seen his glory. The glory of God does return. It doesn't return in Ezekiel's day. It returns in Jesus. And the glory of God returns to the temple when Jesus walks into the temple. In John chapter 2, Jesus walks into the temple and he cleanses the temple. He turns over the tables. And they challenge him and say, how do you have authority? Show us a miracle to show us that you have the right to do this. And Jesus says, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it again in 3 days. And it says right there in John, Jesus was referring to his body. Jesus is saying, I am the temple. Destroy me and I will come back in 3 days. And then, of course, we know in the story of the woman at the well, where Jesus says, out of me will come springs of living water that will well up into eternal life. And so there's a lot we don't know about Ezekiel's temple. There's a lot that we can think about, and it can be a lot of fun to try to piece it all together, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at its heart, what Ezekiel's vision is, it's saying the longing of the nation is for the presence of God and for renewed life. And as Christians, we are reminded that all of our longings are met, not in some future building, but in Jesus. All of our longings are met in Jesus. He is the presence of God among us. He is eternal life. He is the giver of the Holy Spirit. He is the one who renews and refreshes and brings new life wherever he goes. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision. Even if there is a future temple to be built, and even if there is a future desecration of the temple that's part of prophetic history, for us, Jesus is the fulfillment of our longing, and he makes us the temple of God until he returns again.